We all need work. Work is about so much more than a paycheck. It's how we provide for our families and contribute to society. It connects us to a sense of purpose and is key to our well-being. For people with criminal records, stable employment is the best predictor of successful reintegration. When people with criminal records are excluded from the labor market, we see higher levels of recidivism and worse outcomes overall. According to the John Howard Society, hiring discrimination is the biggest barrier faced by people with criminal records. Those job seekers are more likely to be racialized men. At the Social Attitude Psychology Laboratory, we're trying to unpack the barriers faced by some of the most marginalized workers. We're studying how the presence of a criminal record influences hiring decisions for men of different races in the low-wage labor market. Discrimination is what happens when an employee or a job candidate is treated unfavorably on the basis of some personal characteristic. Now, some characteristics are legally protected from discrimination in Canada. It's not legal to discriminate against a worker because of their race. However, there are, in fact, characteristics upon which employers can, and in fact do, legally discriminate. Some of those might be seen as fair. For example, if somebody does not have what are considered the bona fide, the real honest requirements for the job. But others are unfair. For example, body weight, social class, and the possession of a criminal record. Federal legislation prevents employers from discriminating against a worker on the grounds of a criminal conviction for which the person has received a pardon. However, it does not prevent discrimination against those who possess a criminal record. That protection varies by province. Nova Scotia offers no protection. However, it is a protected characteristic under the Human Rights Act in Newfoundland and Labrador, so long as the crime isn't related to the job. British Columbia extends protection to even the perception of criminal culpability. It protects those who are under investigation or who are accused or charged of a crime but not convicted. What that means is that research typically focuses on a single axis, a single cause of discrimination, such as, say, gender. In so doing, we implicitly refer to the experiences of, say, white women by automatically defaulting to the majority group status on all the other domains upon which a person might be discriminated against, thereby failing to understand the qualitatively unique experiences and barriers of people who face multiple axes of discrimination. For example, Black women. Research on hiring discrimination is often not of high methodological quality. For instance, we might measure people's perception that they've been discriminated against, but that's a perception of discrimination. How do you know that that was the real reason? Right? Was it actually because they really did lack the qualifications? We can, in fact, study employment discrimination experimentally. Experimental studies try to control for all the other reasons that a candidate might not be hired so that we can be confident that, say, race is the reason for rejection. In correspondence tests, decision makers are presented with bogus resumes for which only the characteristic of interest, say race, is manipulated. Everything else, education, experience, age, is kept the same. Racializing the resume is accomplished by using names that people associate with particular ethnicities. If a job candidate's name is, say, Ahmed Ali, we would expect that it belongs to a Muslim man. The researchers would then examine how employers react to the resumes. How likely are they to invite the owner of that resume for an interview? One study that manipulated the names on resumes found that the resumes with white-sounding names like Emily or Greg got 50% more callbacks from employers than resumes with Black-sounding names like Lakeisha or Jamal. In audit tests, fictitious candidates are portrayed by live actors who interact with employers in person. The job candidate is played by actors who are of different, say, race, but who are otherwise carefully trained and selected by the researchers to present themselves to employers in the same ways. so that the only meaningful difference between the pair of actors is their ethnicity. Deva Pager had pairs of such actors who were in reality educated and articulate university students apply for real entry-level jobs in Milwaukee, of course, with a bogus resume. For now, let's just focus on the gray bars in the graph, which show the callback results for fictitious candidates who did not have a criminal record. We can see a clear effect of race. The white actors are getting a 34% callback rate on their applications, whereas the Black actors, who present with the same qualifications, behave in the same ways, got a 14% callback rate. That's less than half the callbacks, and we can confidently attribute the cause of the difference in the outcome to race. Comprehensive literature reviews of large numbers of studies like this one indicate strong evidence of hiring discrimination against non-white ethnicities. A large review of studies by Shert and Redden found that overall, ethnic minority candidates had about half the odds of being invited for an interview, meaning that they needed to send out 3 applications for every 2 sent out by white candidates. Canada's observed level of hiring discrimination is similar to that of the United States. That finding does not corroborate with our cultural habit of constructing ourselves as very nice and definitely less racist than our neighbors to the south. We've been talking about direct discrimination, when it's clear that the employer is discriminating against the candidate on the basis of race. We also need to think about indirect discrimination. Indirect discrimination happens when there's a policy or practice that looks fair on the surface because it's applied to everyone in the same way, but it in practice functions to disadvantage people with a certain characteristic. The practice of screening out people with criminal records without good cause effectively disadvantages applicants from groups with higher rates of interaction with the criminal justice system. In Canada, it effectively, if indirectly, disadvantages Black and Indigenous men. At the end of the day, rejection is rejection, regardless of the story that comes with it. Indirect discrimination is as important as direct discrimination, especially where it's easier to justify and conceal. An article by Barrett and Kernan in the journal Personnel Psychology explains that an organization's first line of defense against a discrimination claim is to insist that no discrimination occurred and to counterclaim that the problem was the complainant's performance or behavior. What we know about managers' general perception of a worker's behavior is that it refers more to a generalized, vague, fuzzy like or dislike of the person, maybe about their attitudes and values, rather than to any particular real, actual behavioral incident. It was for that very reason that Flanagan's critical incident technique was developed in 1954. Flanagan provided a set of systematic procedures by which the user could recall and describe how a given behavior impacted a specific outcome. It's accountability. What matters here is actually not whether a negative perception is honestly experienced by the decision makers. It may well be. What's at issue is whether our perceptions are biased and what actions we will justify based on our perceptions. If we are engaging in racial discrimination, we're not likely to admit that even to ourselves. Exclusion is a form of social aggression. It's a kind of punishment. Those who engage in aggressive acts and deliver punishments believe that they're acting justly and that the target, be it an individual or a group, deserves it. There's some narrative that the person or the group is in some manner badly behaved, lazy, deceitful, thieving, violent, or even that they're intrinsically or inherently unworthy, for example, less civilized, less intelligent. What more tempting invitation to exclude and punish could there be than the presence of a criminal record? It's a negative credential. A university degree is a positive credential from an authority that suggests that the employer should consider you favorably. In contrast, the criminal record is a negative credential issued from an authority that certifies bad behavior. Sociologist Deva Paja wrote, "It's the state that certifies particular individuals in ways that qualify them for exclusion and discrimination. It's this official status of the negative credential that differentiates it from other sources of social stigma, offering greater legitimacy to use it as the basis for differentiation and exclusion." We might wonder, how would that manifest itself statistically, acting on that? In the results of an experiment where we randomize white or racialized candidates to bear a criminal record. What would you expect to see if this is in fact something of a bait? Let's return to Pager's study, now considering the effect of adding that criminal record. The black bars show the callback rates for candidates with what we know is a bogus, randomly assigned criminal record. In this study, white applicants with a criminal record had just under half the chance of getting a callback when they had a criminal record compared to when they did not. That value drops to a third for black applicants. There's a suggestion that the weight of the criminal record is heavier for the black applicant. Also notice how a white candidate with a criminal record was a little more likely to get the callback than the black candidate without a record. Another thing that happened is that black actors were sometimes asked up front if they had a criminal record, but that never happened to the white actors. Researchers in the social attitude psychology lab became interested in studying hiring discrimination against Nova Scotia's key marginalized groups, Black and Indigenous people. These groups are known to be multiply disadvantaged compared to the majority. Most research on hiring discrimination is from the United States. In fact, I was only able to find one study on hiring discrimination against Black Canadians. It was an audit study conducted 36 years ago in Toronto. I was not able to find any published research on hiring discrimination against Indigenous Canadians. However, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has called on employers to ensure that Aboriginal peoples have equitable access to jobs, indicating that this is an important area for study. At the SAP Lab, we're currently working on a line of research that addresses those gaps and answers that call. In one experiment by Kilger and colleagues, student research volunteers were asked to select 4 candidates to interview out of a set of 12 resumes. Of course, all the 12 candidates had to have different resumes. Previous research in the lab demonstrated that these 12 resumes were equivalently likely to be selected for a generic labor position. So no resume was better for getting the job than others. Next, names that were perceived as belonging to white, Black, or Indigenous men were then randomly assigned to the resumes. Again, previous research in the lab demonstrated that these names were perceived as belonging to men of certain races. Kyle Richards is perceived to be white. Tyrone Matthews is perceived to be Black. And Sam Aminiak is perceived to be Indigenous. Then, a criminal record was randomly assigned to half the resumes. And here you see the results. So what do you see in that graph? There's a main effect of criminal record. You can see that people with criminal records have fewer invitations to the job. You can see a main effect of race acting particularly against candidates with Indigenous names. Okay? It's an interaction such that the weight of the criminal record is heavier for the Indigenous candidates. Why might we have seen those results? That brings me to the matter of stereotypes. A stereotype is a widely held but fixed and oversimplified idea of a particular type of person or thing. We have stereotypes about people, say, what women are like, and stereotypes about jobs or actual job requirements, say, what nurses are like and what they have to do, what traits they should have. And maybe that involves empathy and tending to others' needs. The nurse stereotype and the woman stereotype fit well together to the point that we might have a hard time seeing men as nurses or recruiting them into the profession. In fact, they tend to get fast-tracked to managerial roles. And one might consider if our stereotypes of men go well with our ideas about managers and leaders. Now, we've learned that in general, having a criminal record is a considerable barrier to getting hired. But what if the work was somehow consistent? Deva Pager related how an employer tried to discourage the white actor without the criminal record from applying for a job as a cleaner because it involved a great deal of dirty work. However, the actor with a criminal record was offered the job on the spot. Researchers have identified a stereotype of criminals as unhygienic, and so possibly that employer saw the person with the criminal record as a better fit for a dirty job. That suggests that it's about the fit between the content of the stereotype, so our expectations about the person, and our expectations about the job. Let's come back to these results from the lab. Interestingly, we failed to replicate Pager's finding of a main effect of race disadvantaging Black candidates. There was, in fact, no disadvantage to Black candidates at all in this study. It was all directed against the Indigenous candidates. What ideas might we have about a labor position? What are some of our ideas or expectations for that job? Sounds like hard work, hard physical work. Is it possible that stereotypes about race and about work were at play here? Do we maybe see Black men as suitable for hard physical labor? There's a long social history of using Black men for that very cause. And why the disfavoring of the Indigenous candidates? Could it reflect the negative stereotype that Indigenous candidates, could it reflect the negative stereotype that Indigenous Canadians don't work hard and would therefore be a less desirable candidate for a job that involves hard work? And we also have to consider possible alternative explanations. What if people's hiring choices are influenced by real labor force patterns? Could it be the case that Indigenous men don't tend to work in this particular job and people are simply selecting to fit the existing pattern? Kind of like hiring the female candidate for a nursing position because most nurses really are female. To address that question, we need to do more than just look at census data for the labor force. We need to examine people's perceptions of how likely men of these three ethnicities are to be working in that particular job. Now, the decision makers' choices reflected their reactions to names. We could also wonder whether there's a name familiarity effect, where the very rare Indigenous names used in our study were less likely to be selected than the more familiar white and Black names. That's not a great alternative explanation. It doesn't fit the data very well. The more familiar white names were not preferred over the less familiar Black names, and related research on that question has not found support for a name familiarity effect. We'll consider it anyway, just to be thorough. What researchers call demand characteristics are another potential explanation. What if the study participants looked at those 12 résumés and noticed the ethnic associations of the names? This experiment was conducted in the presence of a research assistant, and so maybe they didn't want to look racist, so they over-selected the résumés with the Black names. Now, that's not a great explanation either. It doesn't explain the under-selection of the résumés with the Indigenous names. However, it could be the case that anti-Indigenous racism is a more resistant form of bias that majority group members are less aware of. So we'll consider that explanation as well. So we began with a pilot study, and the goal of the pilot study was to find 3 jobs that are not perceived to be differentially associated with white, Black, or First Nations men. So the pilot study generated a list of 36 entry-level jobs that we expected would be associated somehow with Black, white, or First Nations men, or that we thought might not be associated. We generated the list based on census data from Statistics Canada on occupation and industry, and also on media stereotypes. So when I included the tree planter job, I was thinking that maybe that might be associated with First Nations men. 134 participants participated in the pilot study, they were all from Nova Scotia, and we recruited them from MTurk and Reddit and through convenience sample. Had a mean age of 35 years and were 64% male and mostly white. The study had a between subjects design with 4 conditions. So people were asked, depending on which condition they were randomized to, how likely they thought it was that a white, Black, or First Nations Nova Scotian man would have a particular job, say hospital orderly. And if they were in the race neutral condition, then we asked them how likely it would be for any man to have that job. People could answer that they knew or did not know. And if they thought they knew, they could estimate the likelihood. It could say that it could be much less likely that such a man was working in that position to much more likely than average. I conducted an analysis of variance on each job using the condition as an independent variable. We found that there was a main effective condition. So the mean for the white condition was higher than the mean for the race neutral condition. What that suggests is that we're likely to perceive white men as a bit more likely to be working in all the listed jobs. The mean for the white condition was also higher than the mean for the Black condition. And the mean for the white condition was also higher than the mean for the First Nations condition. But there was no statistically significant difference between the Black and First Nations conditions, meaning that for those 36 jobs, people weren't likely to see Black men as more likely to be working in them than Indigenous men, and vice versa. Across all 36 jobs, the means for the white conditions were higher than the means for the other conditions, including that in which race was not mentioned. Okay, and so to underline, that suggests that across all those jobs, white men are more likely to be perceived as working. Let's return to Kilger and colleagues' results and only look at the results for résumés with no criminal record. It shows that Indigenous men are less likely to be invited to an interview. Here are the results from my study for the laborer job title. They suggest that Black and First Nations men are seen as more likely to be working in a laborer position than white men. This actually does reflect the pattern in the census data from the 2016 Statistics Canada Labour Force Survey. However, it's a great exaggeration of the real pattern, where the difference in prevalence rates in the real world are quite small. And that exaggerated perception of real differences is typical in what we call statistical discrimination. However, it suggests that statistical discrimination does not account for the pattern of hiring discrimination seen in the experiment by Kilger and colleagues, as Indigenous men are actually more likely than white men to be really working in this position. That said, we have to keep in mind that these research participants from MTurk are quite different demographically than the primarily female undergraduate student sample that was used in the Kilger study. It does mean, though, that we cannot use the laborer job title for the main study because we need to use jobs that aren't already perceived as more typical for men of certain races. We're going to be looking to find that race by criminal record interaction, but we want to do that while controlling for job type effects. So we need to conduct that study using jobs that don't already have a race effect at baseline. Here are the results of the pilot studies. If an analysis of variance showed that, say, white men were seen as more likely to be working in a given job than Black or First Nations men, I classified it as a white associated job. Examples of such jobs are lifeguard, collections agent, and retail sales associate. In some cases, I assigned the job to 2 ethnic categories. For example, Black and First Nations men are seen as equivalently likely to be working as laborers, but white men are seen as comparatively less likely to be working in this job than either of those groups. So I classified laborer as both a Black and First Nations associated job. Other examples are garbage collector, dishwasher, and janitor. One thing that stands out is that there are no jobs that are uniquely associated with Black or First Nations men, and the largest number of jobs are associated with white men. 15 jobs were not seen as associated with men of a particular race. Say white, Black, and First Nations men were seen as equivalently likely to be working in those positions. So out of that list of 15, we chose 3 job titles to use in the main study. Those were construction worker, mailroom clerk, and tree planter. We also decided to remove the restriction to Nova Scotia and to recruit participants from across Canada. Using those job titles in a simulated hiring scenario, we examined how decision makers reacted to the presence of a criminal record when the job applicant had a white, Black, or Indigenous sounding name. Will decision makers be more sensitive to the presence of a criminal record when the name is Black or Indigenous? Will it affect their attitudes towards the candidate, their perceptions that the candidate's worthiness or unworthiness? Now let's look at the main study. Participants were randomly hired to hire somebody for one of the 3 positions. So let's follow the green path in this diagram and pretend that the participant was asked to hire for the construction worker position. Then the participant was randomly assigned to see a resume belonging to one of the 2 names associated with one of the 3 ethnic groups under study, which were white, Black, or Indigenous. There were 2 white names, so Kyle Richard and Michael McNeil, 2 Black names, Tyrone Matthews and Deshaun Michaels, and 2 Indigenous names, which were Sam Aminayak and Stuart Pegamagabo, that were used in the study. Next, the participant was randomized to see one of 2 resumes that are very similar. So for one, the most recent experience was manual labor, and the other one, it was longshore work. Finally, the person was randomly assigned to see either a positive or a clean criminal record check. So following this particular path, the participant has to decide whether they'll hire Michael, the white longshore worker who has a criminal record and hopes to become a construction worker. There were a total of 72 possible pathways in this between subjects design, as there are 3 jobs by 3 races, by 2 names, by 2 resumes, by 2 criminal record status. Participants were told that the qualifications for the positions were simply completion of high school and 3 to 5 years of previous work experience, and that this candidate had even gone through some pre-screening process. So there's actually no reason not to hire the person. Both the resumes had all the qualifications and more, right? There's absolutely no good reason not to hire this single candidate for the position. The 2 resumes we used were selected out of those 12 used in the Kilger study and slightly adapted. We used 2 resumes so that we could test and control for any resume level effects. And this helps us argue that any differences we might see aren't just some effect of the resume itself. Both resumes showed that the candidate hadn't worked in the last year. That gap could represent many things, including incarceration. Here's what the subsequently presented criminal record check looks like. It simply indicated that a search did or did not find a criminal record. And these are the questions that people were asked. So they're asked, how competent is the applicant for the position? Sorry, it starts out with how likely are you to hire this individual? And they answer on a 7-point scale from extremely unlikely through to extremely likely. And they're also asked a yes/no question. So would you hire this individual, yes or no? And if they said no, then we ask them why they would not hire. Then we ask them a series of questions about their perceptions of the candidate. So how qualified is the applicant for this position based on education and work experience? We gave them a scale running from not at all qualified to very qualified. We asked, how competent is the applicant for the position? How trustworthy is this individual? How likable do you find the applicant? How deceitful is the applicant? And we also asked to test for that name familiarity effect. How familiar is the candidate's name to you? We asked some attention check questions either. When we give surveys out either for course credit or for pay, people sometimes just select things randomly. And so we ask questions like, how likely are you to eat cement? And if somebody said very likely, would think that maybe they're not paying attention or responding in good faith. Now, who were our participants? Responses from 417 people were included in the analyses. Most of these were recruited from MTurk. Canadian MTurkers were compensated 50 cents US if they passed all of the 4 attention check items and responding from Canada, and not Nigeria, Russia, or China. About a third of the participants were recruited from the psychology department subject pool here at St. Mary's University. In return for their participation, these undergraduates earned 1% towards their final grade in an eligible psychology course. Our participants were typically young women in their mid-20s. First, let's look at the results for attention and name recognition accuracy. The attention measure was scored at a 5, and the average score was high. 71% of participants were able to accurately recognize the name that was presented to them on the resume. So what we did after they saw the resume was ask them, what was the name of the person? Could they select that out of a list? And 71% of the time they could. People who seem to be paying attention are very slightly more likely to favor the candidate and to view him positively. That makes sense, given that the candidates are all suitable for the position. However, those are very small effects. Overall, participants were quite likely to favor the candidate. 83% said that yes, they would hire the candidate. The average of 5.2 on the 7-point scale for likelihood to hire represents a space between the anchors of slightly likely and moderately likely to hire. And the correlation between reported likelihood to hire and decision to actually hire the candidate is strong at 0.7. There were some perhaps inattentive participants who rated themselves as extremely unlikely to hire the candidate and then said that yes, they would hire the candidate. Somebody who responds like that probably isn't paying attention. On the other hand, there were people who rated themselves as moderately likely to hire and then said they wouldn't hire the person. But overall, on the whole, we see a pleasingly rational pattern where the tipping point of a positive selection decision is at the midpoint of the likelihood to hire scale. The variables measuring decision makers' perceptions of the candidate were measured on a 5-point scale from, say, not qualified or competent to very qualified or competent. These variables were moderately correlated with favorable hiring decisions. So participants were more likely to hire someone that they saw as trustworthy, likable, etc. And those variables were correlated with each other in a way that suggests that there'd be an overall positive or negative view of a candidate. So if we think that somebody's likable, we're also more likely to evaluate them as qualified, competent, trustworthy. Okay? That's called a halo effect. I conducted analyses of variance on the variables from the rating scales. There were 5 predictor variables, those being candidate race, job type, criminal record status, and the particular name or resume they received out of a pair of 2. I used attention, name recognition accuracy, which means the influence of these variables on the outcome was controlled for statistically. Following the grounded theory approach, I identified the major themes and the reason participants gave for rejecting a candidate. And there were 70 rejected candidates. Why were people rejecting them? Results found a main effect of criminal record status, but no main effect of race. There was, however, an interaction between race and criminal record status, such as the weight of a criminal record is heavier for Black men. It's an indication of indirect but not direct discrimination. So what was the size of this main effect of criminal record? So 93% of candidates without records were hired compared to 73% with records. There's a statistically significant interaction between race and criminal record status. Okay? Here we can see that it doesn't seem to matter much if the white candidate does or does not have a criminal record, but it matters a lot more if a racialized candidate does. And the trend is to a stronger disadvantage for Black candidates. And just to clarify, what I had on the last slide was likelihood to hire, that they're rating on that 1 to 7 scale. And then this one is for the other question, decision to hire, yes or no. And they're both showing the same kind of trend. But it is stronger, it's much stronger for the decision to hire, the actual decision, versus what people say they're likely to do. Now, let's look at why participants said no to a candidate, those who said they'd make an actual decision against that person. First of all, notice that most rejected candidates had criminal records, and the presence of a criminal record is the most commonly cited reason for rejecting a candidate. That reason was often given up cold, right? So the participant would simply say something like, they have a criminal record, that's why they didn't hire. Done deal. When there was elaboration, it would usually be about lack of trustworthiness. Next, notice how most of the rejected candidates are those who had racialized names. So 41% had Black sounding names, 35% had Indigenous sounding names, but only 24% had white names. So overall, 76% of candidates who were rejected had racialized names. But race was never, not one single time, mentioned directly as a reason for rejection. Overall, a greater number of reasons for rejection were associated with Black, okay, at 46% of reasons, or First Nations at 33% of candidates, than white candidates, who accounted for only 21% of rejections. That means that the racialized candidates were more likely to receive multiple reasons for rejection. It's also interesting to notice that one rejected candidate with an Indigenous name was rejected because of his criminal record, but that resume actually came with a clean criminal record check. In this case, the rejected Black, here's an example of multiple reasons for rejecting a candidate. He has a criminal record and a history of low-level work, along with 5 years as a longshoreman, one of the sketchiest jobs out there. That comment was made about a Black candidate with a criminal record. Only resumes with Black names were criticized for their lack of professionalism. Here's an example of one of those comments. The formatting of the resume looks unprofessional, and the information that is presented is at times unclear. For instance, they didn't indicate that they had graduated from high school, just said that they went. Resumes that were associated with white names or Indigenous names were never picked on in that way. The only resume that was rejected because the candidate could do better than that job came with a white name. And the person wrote, unless the applicant had a physical disability, they'd be a poor fit for the monotony of the mail clerk. I'll take a moment to point out the ableism in that comment. There's an assumption there that if somebody does have a physical disability, then they would be a good fit for a monotonous job. Overall, the presence of a criminal record as a reason to reject a candidate was cited more when the candidate had a Black name. Okay? That accounted for 51% of total reasons for rejection, or an Indigenous name at 34% of the reasons. Only 16% of the reasons for rejection were about a criminal record in a white candidate. We did not find any substantive main effects of job type, resume type, or name familiarity, even though white names were the most familiar. We did a qualitative analysis of the perceptions of the candidates, and we found that candidates with criminal records were seen as less trustworthy and less likable and more deceitful. But there was no effect of the criminal record on perceptions of qualification or competence. And there was no main effect of race or race by criminal record interaction on the perception of the candidates in terms of their trustworthiness, likability, deceit, etc. So here's an interesting example from some data that we couldn't include in the study because the person filled in the survey twice. And this survey respondent was a 50-year-old white woman. And the first time she filled in the survey, she was randomly assigned to the candidate Kyle Richards. And she rated him at a 4 for likelihood to hire. That's neither likely nor unlikely to hire. And her decision to hire this candidate, Kyle, who has a criminal record, was higher. Her answer was yes. And she rated him as a 3 for competence, and a 3 for trustworthiness, and a 3 for deceitfulness, and a 2 for likableness. Now, see what happened when she was randomized to the candidate with an Indigenous name, who also had a criminal record, just like Kyle. Well, this time, the rating has gone down from a 4 to a 3, and she's not going to hire him because he has a criminal record. But that didn't matter for Kyle. If you look at her perceptions of this candidate, Sam is rated the same as Kyle for qualifications, competence, and trustworthiness. He's actually seen as less deceitful and more likable. But that didn't help him out. He's not getting hired because of his criminal record. But that doesn't matter for Kyle. That is a really good example of what indirect discrimination looks like. We're not saying that we're not hiring Sam because he's Indigenous. We're not hiring him because of his criminal record, but that only matters for the Indigenous candidate in this example. So here's something that might help unpack that. So why is there no race by criminal record status interaction on any of the variables reflecting the participants' perception of the candidates? So maybe those perceptions, right? She doesn't hire Sam, and it's because he has a criminal record, just like Kyle, and she actually rates Sam more positively as less deceitful and more likable. Maybe those perceptions aren't driving the hiring decisions about racialized candidates with criminal records. So maybe being likable doesn't help as much for an Indigenous candidate. You'll recall that our participants came from 2 samples, MTurk and the psychology department subject pool. The race by criminal record effect is actually only significant in the MTurk sample. As you can see from the graph to the left, the psychology students show a bias against candidates with criminal records, but they don't treat racialized candidates with criminal records differently from white candidates with criminal records. And they also don't show evidence of a direct racial discrimination or indirect racial discrimination based on the criminal record status. That effect comes from MTurk participants, where the criminal record is perceived more negatively for candidates with Black names. There could be many reasons for those differences. The psychology students were younger, more often female, and included more Black and Indigenous people in the sample. While they were very slightly less attentive, they also had better name recognition. And we'd expect that just because they're younger. So there are demographic differences between those 2 samples. So the study provided clear evidence of hiring discrimination against candidates with criminal records. So there is evidence of direct discrimination against people with criminal records, but no evidence of direct discrimination based on race. Yet, we found clear evidence of indirect discrimination based on race. Right? There was a race by criminal record interaction and hiring outcomes, especially on the actual decision versus people's perception of how likely they were to hire. Okay? That disadvantaged racialized, more particularly Black candidates. And participants don't show any awareness of their bias, as we saw in that example of the lady who was not going to hire Sam because of his criminal record, but would happily hire the white candidate with the same record. There was no evidence of hiring discrimination in the SONA sample. That was the psychology subject pool subsample. And that could be for many reasons. Maybe there are differences in political views. The psychology students may have received more education and training in anti-racism. But there's also a risk of demand characteristics with psychology students because they know a lot more about psychological research. So we might ask, would these results generalize if we recruited students from other departments? The strengths of the study is its internal validity. We were able to address a number of potential confounds that came up with the previous research. We controlled for name familiarity, for demand characteristics, for statistical discrimination. And we designed a manipulation that works, despite the risks of ceiling effects from the design. And the design risked ceiling effects because people were asked whether they would hire somebody who was completely qualified and the only candidate. It's surprising that 100% of people didn't just always say yes. Okay, so it's interesting and important that we were still able to pick up evidence of discrimination in that design. The study answers calls for an EDIA lens in IO psychology. It is the only study on it's the only study on hiring discrimination against Black and Indigenous men with criminal records in Canada that I'm aware of outside of the pilot research I previously discussed. It takes an intersectional perspective and incorporates qualitative methods. There are limitations to the study as well. One of them was the internal validity of the study, which took place in an uncontrolled setting. So this took place during COVID. We didn't have people coming into the lab where they'd be monitored. They were doing the survey at home on their own time where there could be a lot of distractions. Someone left their survey open for up to 22 hours. We also did not control for crime type. So this study didn't say what the crime was. It just said there was a criminal record. And people might have different expectations of what a crime would be for a white person or a Black person or an Indigenous person. So for instance, white people are more likely to have DUIs. Okay, so people might have different expectations of what a criminal record could mean for these three groups. And that might somehow interact with expectations for the job. Okay. Participants only asked to know more about a criminal record when there was a Black name. We also only tested 3 particular jobs. That was the construction worker, tree planter, and mailroom clerk jobs. And I don't know how this would generalize to other job types or jobs that are outside or above the low-wage labor market. It's also not a real hiring scenario. Okay? It did not include a job description. Candidates are not compared against other candidates in a pool. Participants are not real employers. They're people participating in a study. And there's no organizational context. So the person's making their own decision without say, taking any HR policies into consideration. Future research should control for or explore the effects of the type of crime. Pager's research that we discussed in the introduction actually did specify a certain crime. It was drug possession with intent to distribute. And so future research probably needs to do that. Future research could take place with real employers. So you could send out bogus resumes to real job postings and see what kind of response rate we get back. You can also do studies with panels of HR professionals. You could do audit studies with in-person or virtual interviews. Research on employment discrimination is heavily focused on the selection phase. Compared to other potential contexts for employment discrimination, it's much easier and simpler to study and much more accessible to researchers. But how many companies are going to let us in to study and perhaps detect and report bias in their internal processes and how they promote people or in how they discipline or terminate people? But we do need to remember that employees have a life cycle in an organization that goes well beyond selection, from how they're recruited past selection to how they're onboarded, to whether they can access appropriate and effective training and development, to whether they receive promotions or hit a glass ceiling, to whether their performance is assessed fairly, and finally, to how fairly they're treated in informal and formal processes regarding conflict resolution, complaints, discipline, and termination. So you see, IO psychologists wanting to promote justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace have much to learn and do. You're not Jedi yet. In a seminal article published in the flagship Journal of Industrial and Organizational Psychology, titled Gone Fishing, IO psychologists missed opportunities to understand marginalized employees' experiences with discrimination. Ruggs and colleagues criticized IO psychologists for disregarding the perspectives and lived experiences of diverse workers, instead centering on majority group members' perceptions of them. I did that too. I met with Donnie Fairfax, Employment Engagement Manager at Nova Scotia Works in Dartmouth, and his colleague Judy Palmer, an employment counselor with Correctional Services Canada. They work directly with recently incarcerated racialized men. And I learned that one of the best things that we can do is to support career development. Many struggle with reintegration because they don't have the social or professional skills that they need to succeed on the outside. So we can advocate for the employment of people with criminal records and for federal protection against discrimination, and by raising awareness for the reality of indirect discrimination. Thank you for your attention. I welcome your questions, comments, and good-natured criticism.